The workshop smelled of burnt metal and machine oil. The sound of clicking keyboards and the low hum of testing equipment filled the air. 15 engineers were crowded around a large metal frame that was supposed to be the company's breakthrough invention, a new type of automated system that could change how small factories worked. But right now it was just sitting there, lifeless, with a single red light blinking stubbornly on the control panel. For 3 weeks, the team had tried everything. They had replaced parts, rewritten the code, reset the circuits, and run hundreds of simulations. Nothing worked. Each day ended the same way, with frustration, tired faces, and quiet arguments that faded into silence. At the center of it all stood Ethan Cole, the founder and CEO. He wasn't wearing a suit or tie, just a faded gray hoodie, jeans, and eyes that carried more exhaustion than sleep. He was the kind of man who built things with his hands before he built them with his mind. Years ago, he had started this company from his garage, working late into the night while his young son slept in a crib beside him. Every tool in that workshop, every screw in that machine, felt like part of his own story. Now, watching his best engineers struggle, Ethan felt a kind of helplessness he hadn't known in years. "Try running the main program again," he said quietly, rubbing the back of his neck. One of the engineers sighed. "We've done that 12 times, sir. The output crashes before it hits sequence 4. Ethan didn't answer. He just stared at the screen as lines of code flickered and vanished. The machine buzzed, lights blinked, then silence. Another failure. He turned away and walked toward the corner of the room where blueprints covered the wall. His reflection in the window looked older than he remembered. The company was depending on this new product. Investors were waiting and contracts were ready to sign. If they missed the deadline again, they could lose everything. A small voice in his mind whispered what he didn't want to admit. Maybe we're not going to fix this. The thought made his stomach twist. One of the engineers, a woman in her 30s with tired eyes, leaned back in her chair. "We've checked every connection, every line of code. It's not a software bug. It's something in the hardware." Ethan nodded. "Then let's start again from the beginning." Groans filled the room. They had already done that dozens of times, but he couldn't give up. He had promised his team, his investors, and most of all his son, that he would make this work. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the windows orange and gold. The day was ending, but no one dared to leave. Ethan's phone buzzed on the table. He looked at it and saw a message from his son. "Good night, Dad. Don't forget dinner this time." He smiled faintly. He'd forgotten again. He always told himself he was doing this for his boy, for the future, for stability. But lately, the price of chasing that dream felt heavier. He slipped the phone into his pocket and turned back to the team. "Let's take 5 minutes. Clear your heads." The engineers scattered. Some went for coffee, some just sat staring blankly at the floor. The sound of the vending machine broke the silence. As Ethan stood by the door trying to think, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Tough night again, boss." He turned to see Luis, the workshop's maintenance helper, holding a broom in one hand and a small rag in the other. Luis was in his late 50s with kind eyes and the kind of calm presence that made everyone feel at ease. He wasn't an engineer, at least not on paper. His job was to keep the workshop clean, fix light bulbs, and make sure everyone had what they needed. Ethan managed a weak smile. "You could say that. The whole system's down again. We've tried everything." Luis nodded slowly. "I see the lights blinking." "Same problem?" "Yeah, sequence 4. Always the same place." Luis leaned on his broom and gave a quiet chuckle. "You know, machines can be funny. Sometimes it's not the big parts that cause trouble. It's the small things, the ones we overlook because they seem too simple." Ethan looked at him, then shook his head with a tired laugh. "If you've got any magic, Luis, I'll take it." "I don't have magic," Luis said gently. "Just patience. You taught me that, remember?" It was true. When Ethan first hired him years ago, Luis had been struggling to find steady work. He'd come in one morning asking if there was anything at all he could do. Ethan had seen something in his eyes, a quiet dignity, and offered him the job without asking for a resume. Luis had never let him down. Now seeing him standing there, broom in hand, Ethan felt a strange comfort. Luis looked at the machine again. "You've got good people working on this. Maybe they just need rest?" "Machines don't always talk when you're tired," Ethan smiled. "Maybe you're right." He watched as Luis returned to sweeping the floor near the workbench, careful not to disturb the engineer's equipment. The man had a way of moving that was unhurried, thoughtful, as if every motion had purpose. When the break was over, the team gathered again. The air was heavier now. Ethan clapped his hands once.
All right, let's give it one last shot tonight. They got back to work.
The room filled again with clicking, humming, and muttered calculations. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. The coffee pot was empty, and the floor was scattered with paper cups and tool wrappers. Ethan's eyes were red from staring at screens. At one point, one of the engineers slammed his notebook shut. "It doesn't make sense. The system's reading an error that doesn't exist," another engineer replied. "Maybe the input sensors are misaligned. We already recalibrated them, but if there's a hardware offset..." Ethan raised a hand. "Let's check it again tomorrow." No one's thinking straight. The team began packing up, grumbling quietly. Some looked defeated, others just numb. Ethan stayed behind, staring at the machine one more time. The blinking red light looked almost like it was mocking him. He walked around the prototype, running his hand along the cold metal surface. He knew every inch of it, every wire, every screw. He had helped design the thing himself, long before the company had grown big enough to have teams of engineers. Now, despite all his experience, he couldn't fix it. Luis came back with a trash bin, picking up the empty cups. "You heading home soon?" "Yeah," Ethan said softly. "Maybe after one more look," Luis smiled. "You said that yesterday, too." Ethan chuckled under his breath. "I know." Luis looked at the machine thoughtfully. "Mind if I see it up close?" Ethan blinked, surprised. "You, why?" "Just curious," Luis said, shrugging. "I've seen you working on it for weeks. Maybe I'll spot something." Ethan laughed a little. 15 engineers can't fix it, and you think you can?" Luis smiled faintly. "I didn't say that. Sometimes when you look at something too long, you stop really seeing it." Ethan hesitated, then stepped aside. "Go ahead." Luis put down his broom and walked over. He didn't touch anything, just leaned in, studying the control panel. His eyes moved slowly, carefully. Then he crouched down, tracing the wiring with his gaze. Ethan watched him curiously. After about half a minute, Luis pointed at a small sensor near the base. "That piece right there, it looks upside down." Ethan frowned. "The sensor? That's impossible. It's installed according to the schematic." "Maybe," Luis said with a shrug. "But it's reading light from the wrong side. If the reflection isn't right, the machine might think something's wrong even when it's fine." Ethan knelt beside him, his fatigue fading for a moment. He examined the sensor closely. Luis was right. The small metal part was slightly tilted, its reflective surface turned inward instead of outward. "How did we miss that?" Ethan muttered. Luis smiled gently. "It's easy to miss small things when you're chasing big ones." Ethan stared at him for a moment, speechless. He stood up, turning the thought over in his mind. If Luis was right, then this tiny mistake, this barely noticeable misalignment, could be what had stopped everything. He didn't say anything yet. He just patted Luis on the shoulder and said, "Thanks, old friend. Let's test that tomorrow." Luis nodded and went back to cleaning as if nothing important had just happened. Ethan sat at his desk long after everyone left. He couldn't shake what he'd seen. 15 brilliant engineers had missed something that a quiet janitor noticed in seconds. It wasn't just humbling, it was inspiring. Outside, the night was still. The city lights shimmered faintly through the workshop windows. Ethan finally turned off the monitors and leaned back in his chair. He thought of his son again, of the promise he'd made to keep going, no matter how hard it got. Tomorrow they'd test Luis's theory, and deep down, something in him, something he hadn't felt in weeks, believed that maybe, just maybe, they were about to turn everything around. The next morning, the workshop was quieter than usual. The engineers walked in slowly, holding coffee cups and wearing the same tired expressions. Most of them didn't expect anything new to happen. After so many failed tests, it felt like hope had already packed its bags and left. Ethan arrived early, as always. He had barely slept. The thought of what Luis said kept running through his mind all night. He kept picturing that tiny sensor turned the wrong way, wondering how something so small could cause so much chaos. When Luis came in, he gave Ethan a small nod. Neither of them said much. They didn't have to. There was a silent understanding between them, an unspoken trust. Ethan gathered the engineers around. "Before we start the usual tests," he said, "I want to check something first. It's a small detail, but I think it's worth a look. One of the senior engineers frowned. We've checked every component multiple times. What detail are we talking about? Ethan walked over to the prototype and pointed at the sensor Luis had mentioned. This one, he said. It might be installed the wrong way. The room went silent for a moment. That's not possible, one of them muttered. It's aligned exactly as per the design. I know, Ethan said calmly. But we're going to test it anyway. A few of the engineers exchanged skeptical glances, but they knew Ethan well enough not to argue. He was fair but firm. When he made a decision, you followed it through. They powered down the machine and carefully adjusted the sensor. It only took a few seconds. The change was so subtle that it almost looked the same afterward. Okay, Ethan said, stepping back. Let's power it up. One of the engineers pressed the switch. The machine whirred to life. The screen came on, showing the same code sequence as before. Everyone leaned in closer. The red light blinked once, twice, then turned green. The machine continued to run. The sequence that had always crashed before now moved forward smoothly. The mechanical arms began their programmed movement, something no one had seen happen in weeks, and then, just like that, it completed the full cycle without a single error. For a few seconds, the room was completely silent. Then someone whispered, "It worked." Another voice followed, louder this time. It actually worked. Cheers erupted around the room. Engineers who had been frustrated for days suddenly laughed, clapped each other on the back, and shouted in disbelief. The sound of celebration filled the workshop. Ethan didn't join in right away. He just stood there, staring at the green light, feeling something heavy lift off his shoulders. He let out a long breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Then he smiled. Really smiled. For the first time in weeks. He turned to look for Luis, but the older man wasn't there. Ethan found him a few minutes later in the hallway, cleaning near the supply closet as if nothing had happened. Ethan walked up and said, "You won't believe it." Luis looked up with a small grin. "It worked?" Ethan nodded. "You were right. That tiny sensor was the problem all along." Luis chuckled softly. "Sometimes the smallest things cause the biggest headaches." Ethan shook his head, still in disbelief. 15 engineers spent weeks trying to fix it. You looked at it for 30 seconds and saw the answer. Luis waved his hand. It's nothing. I just noticed something out of place. You and your team did all the hard work." But Ethan didn't see it that way. He knew what Luis had done. It wasn't luck, it was instinct, experience, and quiet observation. The kind of intelligence that didn't need a fancy degree to prove itself. As they talked, one of the engineers came running down the hallway. "Ethan, the output readings are perfect. We've run 3 cycles with 0 errors." Ethan laughed, clapping the engineer on the shoulder. "Good, keep testing." "Let's make sure it's stable." The rest of the day was a blur of excitement. The engineers ran more tests, collected data, and watched the machine perform flawlessly. It was like watching a miracle unfold right in front of them. Ethan walked around the workshop smiling as he saw the energy return to his team. The same people who had looked broken just yesterday now stood taller, their eyes bright again. During lunch, the engineers gathered in the break area, still talking about what happened. One of them said, "I can't believe we missed something so simple." Another replied, "Sometimes we're so deep in the code we forget to look at the actual machine." Ethan sat with them, listening quietly. He didn't say it out loud, but he was thinking the same thing. He had been so focused on deadlines, investors, and pressure that he forgot where it all started, with people who noticed things, who cared, who took time to look closer. By evening, when the final tests were done, the prototype was officially working. It passed every check, every sequence, every safety run. The system was ready for production. As the team began packing up, Ethan stood by the window looking out at the fading sunset. The light coming through the glass painted everything in a warm golden glow. He thought of how close they had come to failure, and how one quiet man had turned everything around. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Ethan stayed behind. He walked over to the machine one last time and rested his hand on it. It was almost peaceful now, humming gently in standby mode. He thought about Luis, about the way he had spotted the mistake without hesitation, about how humble he'd been afterward, as if what he did didn't matter. Ethan couldn't shake the thought that there were probably thousands of people like Luis out there, smart, capable, overlooked, not because they lacked talent, but because no one ever gave them a real chance. He remembered the first day he met Luis. The man had come into the office holding a worn folder with old certificates from his home country. His English wasn't perfect back then, but his eyes were clear and honest. He had said, "I can fix things. Any things." Ethan had hired him on the spot, not knowing one day that same man would save his company. As Ethan turned off the lights, he made a silent promise to himself. He wasn't going to forget this lesson. The next morning, word spread quickly. The investors were thrilled. The client who had been waiting for months finally confirmed the deal. Emails of congratulations poured in. The company was back on track and stronger than ever. But Ethan didn't rush into meetings or celebrations. His first stop that day wasn't the conference room, it was the maintenance office. Luis was there fixing a loose door hinge. Ethan waited until he finished, then said, "Can we talk for a minute?" Luis nodded and followed him to his office. Ethan closed the door behind them and smiled. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about what happened yesterday," Luis chuckled. "It was a lucky moment." Ethan shook his head. "No, it wasn't luck. It was you. You saved this project. You saved the company." Luis looked down, almost embarrassed. "I just did what anyone would do." "That's not true," Ethan said softly. "You did what no one else could. And I'm not going to pretend that doesn't matter." He opened a folder on his desk and slid a paper across. "Starting today, I want you to be part of the technical team. Officially. You'll help oversee equipment maintenance and diagnostics. It's a promotion and a raise, of course." Luis's eyes widened. "Me, but I'm not—" "You are," Ethan interrupted gently. "You've earned it. You've been more than a helper for a long time. It's time everyone saw that." For a moment, Luis didn't speak. His hands trembled slightly as he looked at the paper. Then his eyes softened. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I don't know what to say." Ethan smiled. "Just keep being yourself. That's all I ask." They shook hands, and for a second, neither of them wanted to let go. After Luis left the office, Ethan sat back in his chair and stared at the window. He thought about all the people in the world who worked quietly, unseen, doing their best without recognition. He wanted to build a company that noticed them, that gave them a chance to grow. He didn't know it yet, but that single decision, to believe in someone others had overlooked, would change not just his business, but the lives of many who came after. That night, when Ethan got home, his son was waiting for him with a big smile. "You're home early," the boy said. Ethan laughed. "Yeah, for once." His son handed him a plate of spaghetti. "You said we'd eat together tonight." Ethan sat down at the table, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. "And I meant it." They ate together, talking about school, the workshop, and small things that didn't matter but somehow did. As his son laughed about a story from class, Ethan found himself smiling without thinking. He realized then that life wasn't just about fixing machines or meeting deadlines. It was about people, the ones who believed in you, the ones you believed in, and the moments that reminded you what really mattered. The project was saved. The company was safe, and the future looked bright again. But more than that, Ethan had learned something priceless. Sometimes the person who helps you the most is the one you least expect. And that was just the beginning. The following days felt different in the workshop. The air was lighter, filled with laughter and quiet confidence instead of tension and worry. The hum of the machines now sounded like music, and people moved with a new kind of energy. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt proud just walking through those doors. The new system, the one that had caused so many sleepless nights, was finally working perfectly. Clients who had once gone silent were calling again, asking for meetings and demos. The company was back on its feet, but this time Ethan didn't want it to just survive. He wanted it to mean something. He watched his team with quiet admiration. The same engineers who had once doubted themselves now worked like a well-oiled machine. They stayed late, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Everyone was invested, and that made all the difference. But the person who stood out most wasn't an engineer at all. It was Luis. Ever since his promotion, Luis had been working side by side with the technical staff. He didn't sit in an office or give long speeches. He preferred to be on the floor, checking sensors, testing circuits, and teaching the younger workers how to spot problems early. His calm voice and steady hands made him the person everyone went to when things got tricky. One afternoon, as the team gathered for a test run, a new intern whispered to another, "That's the guy who fixed the whole thing, right?" The other nodded. "Yeah, he saw what no one else did." Luis overheard but didn't respond. He just smiled quietly and kept working. Ethan noticed this from a distance. He admired how Luis never let pride get in the way of purpose. Most people would have bragged or reminded others what they'd done, but not him. He just kept moving forward, focused on helping. Later that day, Ethan called a quick meeting. Everyone gathered near the prototype table. The machine stood gleaming under the workshop lights, a symbol of what teamwork could do. "I just wanted to say something before we move on to the next phase," Ethan began. "You all worked hard, and I'm proud of what we've achieved. But there's one person here who reminded me of something important. That real skill isn't about fancy titles or long resumes. It's about how much you care, how closely you pay attention, and how willing you are to help." He turned toward Luis. "You showed us all that, and because of that, we're not just back in business, we're better than before." There was a moment of silence before the room filled with applause. Luis looked genuinely surprised, his face turning a little red. He gave a small nod, still smiling modestly. After the meeting, Ethan walked over and said quietly, "You're getting used to people clapping for you yet?" Luis laughed softly. "Not really. I'd rather they save the clapping for when we make the next one work." Ethan grinned. "Fair enough." The next few weeks were filled with long hours, but good spirits. Orders started coming in, and the company's name began to spread in trade magazines. Investors who had once doubted Ethan now called him with offers and praise. But none of that changed how he led. He still came to the workshop every day, rolled up his sleeves, and worked alongside his team. Sometimes he'd bring his son on weekends. The boy loved watching the machines move and the sparks fly as metal met metal. He'd sit beside Luis, who always found a way to teach him something new. "See this?" Luis would say, pointing to a circuit board. "Electricity is like water. It needs the right path. Too much in one place and it overflows. Too little and nothing works." The boy would nod, fascinated. Ethan would watch from across the room, grateful for the friendship forming between them. One evening, when most of the team had gone home, Ethan and Luis stayed behind to run one last system check. The machine had been performing well all day, but Ethan liked to double-check before calling it a night. As they worked, Luis said quietly, "You know, back in my country, I used to build machines too. Not as fancy as this, but I loved it. When I came here, I couldn't get hired for anything like that. My papers didn't transfer. I had to start from scratch." Ethan listened carefully. He'd known bits and pieces of Luis's past, but never the full story. "So I cleaned floors," Luis continued. "Fixed doors. Changed light bulbs. I didn't mind. Work is work. But I missed this. The feeling of solving something. The sound of a machine coming alive again." Ethan leaned on the table. "You never told me that." Luis smiled faintly. "You never asked." There was no bitterness in his tone, just calm acceptance. That simple honesty hit Ethan harder than any criticism could have. He realized how easy it was to overlook someone's potential just because of what was written on paper. "You should have been doing this all along," Ethan said. Luis looked at him. "I am now. That's what matters." Ethan nodded slowly. "You're right. It does." They stood there in silence for a moment, listening to the hum of the running machine. Then Ethan said, "You know, I've been thinking. Maybe we should start something new here. Something that helps people like you. People with skills who just need a chance to use them." Luis raised an eyebrow. "Like a training program?" "Exactly," Ethan said. "A scholarship, an apprenticeship. Something where people can learn even if they don't have a degree or the right paperwork. We'll teach them what we know and they'll teach us things we might have forgotten." Luis looked thoughtful. "That could change a lot of lives." "That's the plan," Ethan said. "Starting with yours." Luis laughed quietly. "Mine's already changing, boss." That night Ethan couldn't sleep again, but this time it wasn't because of worry. It was because ideas were pouring into his mind. He wrote notes in a small notebook, sketching out what he later called the Second Chance program. The idea was simple. Give people with technical ability but without formal qualifications a place to learn and grow. When he presented the plan to the board a week later, some were hesitant. "It sounds noble," one of them said, "but how do we know it'll help the company?" Ethan smiled. "Because it already has. You just haven't realized it yet." He told them the story of the broken prototype, The one 15 engineers couldn't fix, but a man with no title did in 30 seconds. When he finished, the room was silent. No one had anything to argue. The program was approved within the month. The first group of trainees arrived not long after. They were from all kinds of backgrounds. Some were former mechanics, others self-taught hobbyists, a few who had worked factory jobs for years. Luis helped design the training sessions, focusing on hands-on experience instead of just textbooks. He treated every trainee with patience and respect, remembering what it felt like to be underestimated. The workshop became a place of laughter, learning, and second chances. Ethan often stood at the back, watching it all unfold. The sound of tools, the low buzz of conversation, the spark of discovery. It reminded him why he started the company in the first place. One afternoon, as Luis was showing a trainee how to read voltage levels, Ethan approached. "How's our class doing?" he asked. Luis smiled. "Better than I expected. One of them fixed a wiring issue yesterday before I even saw it." "Good," Ethan said. "That's what we want, to see people grow." Luis nodded. "Feels good, doesn't it?" "It does," Ethan said softly. "More than I can explain." As the months passed, the company became known not just for its products, but for its culture. Other companies started visiting to learn how they trained their teams. Articles were written about the Second Chance program and how it helped rebuild confidence in people who had been forgotten by the system. Ethan and Luis never bragged about it. They just kept doing what they believed was right. One evening, after a long day, they stood outside the workshop looking at the sky. The sunset painted the clouds in soft shades of orange and pink. Ethan said quietly, "You know, when I first started this company, I thought success meant money, big offices, and big clients. But it's not that. It's this: people, growth, purpose." Luis smiled. "I think you finally built the machine you were meant to build." Ethan looked at him. "Which one?" "The one that helps people." Ethan laughed softly, but he knew Luis was right. As the last light faded, the two men stood there for a while, listening to the world settle down for the night. The workshop behind them glowed faintly through the windows, a quiet reminder that sometimes the biggest changes begin with the smallest fixes. And though neither said it out loud, they both knew that what had happened wasn't just luck or chance. It was something deeper. Proof that every person, no matter their title, had the power to make a difference. That single sensor had done more than fix a machine. It had changed lives. The following month began with something new, an excitement that ran through every corner of the company. For the first time, the big conference hall wasn't filled with investors or clients, but with workers, technicians, trainees, and their families. Rows of chairs were lined up. A small stage was set at the front, and banners hung from the ceiling with simple words, "Innovation through people." Ethan had called this meeting for one reason: to talk about what had changed, and to finally give credit where it was due. As people filled the hall, the air buzzed with quiet conversations. Many of the new trainees from the Second Chance program were there too, sitting together in the back, looking both nervous and proud. Some of them had never worked in a place that treated them with real respect before. Ethan stood behind the stage curtain, adjusting the microphone on his collar. He wasn't nervous, but his heart beat a little faster than usual. He had given many speeches in his career, but this one felt personal. When the room finally settled, he walked to the podium. The room fell silent. He began simply. "I've been building machines most of my life," he said. "But over the last few months, I learned something important. The strongest part of a company isn't the metal or the code. It's the people who believe in what they're building." He looked around the room. "Some of you were here when everything almost fell apart. You remember those nights when we thought we'd never fix the prototype. 15 of our best engineers tried everything. We were ready to give up." He paused, his voice softening. "And then someone saw what we didn't." The audience was still. He wasn't part of the engineering team. He wasn't even in the meetings. He was the man who cleaned the floors, fixed broken lights, and helped everyone without being asked. But when he looked at the problem, he saw what the rest of us missed, and he solved it in seconds. He turned slightly and gestured toward the side of the stage. "That man is Luis." There was a ripple of applause that quickly grew into a standing ovation. People cheered, some even whistled. Luis, sitting quietly in the front row, looked completely overwhelmed. His hands trembled slightly as he stood, nodding awkwardly to the crowd. Ethan waited for the applause to fade before continuing. What happened that day wasn't just a fix to a machine. It was a reminder of what real value looks like. It reminded me that talent doesn't always wear a badge or hold a title. Sometimes it carries a broom, shows up early, and notices what others overlook. He paused again, letting the words sink in. Luis taught me something that day. That leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about listening, trusting, and believing that everyone has something worth giving. The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't just quiet. It was emotional. People looked at Luis with admiration, some with tears in their eyes. Ethan continued. That's why today we're not just celebrating a success story. We're starting something new, something we're calling the Second Chance Program. It's for people who have the skills, the heart, and the determination to build, but never got the chance to prove it. He looked toward the trainees sitting in the back. You're the first class. You're the proof that what we're building isn't just machines, it's futures. Applause broke out again, softer this time, but full of warmth. Ethan smiled and stepped back from the podium. And now, he said, I'd like Luis to say a few words. Luis shook his head instantly, half smiling in protest. Ethan leaned toward him and said quietly, They need to hear from you. Reluctantly, Luis walked up to the stage. The microphone looked too big for him, and for a moment he just stood there staring at the crowd. Then he said, I'm not a man of many words. I'm more used to fixing things than talking about them. The audience chuckled softly. He continued, When I came to this country, I just wanted to work. I didn't care what kind of job it was. I cleaned, I fixed doors, I carried boxes. I was happy to help. But I always missed building things. The feeling you get when something broken starts working again. He paused, glancing at Ethan. That day when the machine stopped, I didn't mean to do anything special. I just saw something that didn't look right. Anyone could have seen it. But the difference is, someone gave me the chance to look. The room grew quiet again. Luis smiled gently. That's all most people need, a chance. I was lucky to get one. And I'll spend the rest of my time here making sure others get one too. When he finished, the applause was even louder than before. Ethan clapped the hardest. After the ceremony, people surrounded Luis, shaking his hand, thanking him, taking pictures. He looked a little embarrassed but happy. Ethan stood to the side, watching it all unfold with quiet pride. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Ethan found himself standing alone in the empty hall. The chairs were stacked. The banners still swayed lightly from the air vents. He looked up at them. Innovation through people. He whispered to himself, that's what it should have always been about. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The Second Chance program became more than just an idea. It became the company's heartbeat. Applications poured in from across the city. People who had once worked in factories, mechanics who had lost jobs, even young people who couldn't afford college. All of them wanted to learn. Luis spent hours every day helping train them. He had a gift for teaching without making people feel small. He never talked down to anyone. He simply guided them with patience. One afternoon, Ethan watched him showing a group how to troubleshoot a circuit. He noticed how carefully Luis listened to each question, how he smiled when they finally understood. It reminded Ethan of how he used to be in the early days, curious, passionate, full of purpose. During a break, Ethan said, You know, you've become the best teacher I've ever had in this company. Luis chuckled. Funny, I've never thought of myself as a teacher. That's exactly why you're good at it, Ethan replied. You teach because you care, not because it's your job. Luis nodded, thoughtful. You know, when I was younger, I always believed that the best way to fix a machine was to understand the person who built it. People leave little pieces of themselves in the things they make. You can't fix one without respecting the other. Ethan smiled. I think that's true for people too. Maybe, Luis said softly. Sometimes people just need someone to see what's still working inside them instead of what's broken. That line stuck with Ethan for days. It reminded him of the moment he found Luis years ago. Just a quiet man looking for any kind of work. Now he couldn't imagine the company without him. A few months later, a local news station heard about the Second Chance program. They wanted to feature it on their evening show. When the crew arrived, they filmed the trainees at work, Luis teaching, and Ethan explaining the company's journey. During the interview, the reporter asked Ethan, What inspired you to start this program? Ethan smiled and looked at Luis, who stood nearby, pretending to be busy with a toolbox. "A man who saw what everyone else missed," he said. He reminded me that sometimes the best ideas don't come from the top. They come from people who care enough to look closer. The story went viral online. Messages started pouring in from all over the world. People wrote about how they'd been overlooked in their jobs, how they wished more leaders thought like Ethan. But Ethan didn't see himself as a hero. He knew the real hero was the man who fixed a machine with his eyes, not his tools. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the workshop in gold, Ethan stood with Luis by the big window overlooking the city. They didn't talk much. They just watched as lights began to turn on in the buildings below. After a while, Ethan said, "You know, when that machine failed, I thought it was the end of everything. But it turned out to be the beginning of something better." Luis smiled quietly. "Sometimes things have to stop working before they can start working right." Ethan laughed softly. "You always have a way of putting things that make sense." Luis shrugged. "Machines, people, life, it's all the same. You just have to listen when something's not running smooth." They stood there until the light faded. Behind them, the hum of the machines carried on, steady and strong, just like the people who built them. Ethan knew this was only the start. The company would grow, yes, but not just in size or money. It would grow in meaning. And one day, when someone asked him what he was most proud of, he knew it wouldn't be a machine or a patent. It would be the moment a quiet helper solved a problem no one else could and changed everything. The morning sun poured through the wide glass windows of the main office, painting everything in a warm golden glow. The air inside the company felt different now, lighter, more alive. There was laughter in the hallways, quiet music from the workshop, and a new sense of pride in the way everyone worked. Ethan sat at his desk, watching the team through the window of his office. Every time he looked out, he saw something that made him smile. A group of new trainees laughing while setting up a prototype. Two senior engineers explaining diagrams to a young woman who had joined the Second Chance program last month. And right in the center of it all, Luis moving from table to table, guiding, teaching, fixing small mistakes without ever making anyone feel small. It had been 6 months since the company launched the program, and it had already changed everything. Production had improved, efficiency had doubled, and for the first time in years, the workshop ran with both skill and heart. But beyond numbers and profits, there was something deeper, a shared belief that every person mattered. Ethan leaned back in his chair, thinking about how far they'd come. He remembered the sleepless nights, the arguments, the fear of losing everything. Now, when he looked around, he saw more than a business. He saw a family. Later that morning, his assistant knocked gently on the door. "Sir, you have a visitor," she said with a smile. Ethan looked up. "Who is it?" "It's a man from the city council. He says he's heard about the Second Chance program." Ethan stood. "Send him in." A middle-aged man entered, holding a folder and wearing a curious smile. He introduced himself and explained that the city wanted to partner with Ethan's company. They wanted to replicate the program across other small industries to help train and employ people who had been struggling to find work. Ethan listened carefully, nodding. "That sounds wonderful," he said. "But we'll need the right people to guide it." The man smiled. "We were hoping Luis could help lead the training sessions." Ethan's eyes brightened. "He'll be thrilled." After the meeting, Ethan walked straight to the workshop. Luis was there, helping two trainees solder a new circuit board. His hands were steady, his voice calm and patient. Ethan waited until they were done before speaking. "You might want to sit down for this," he said with a grin. Luis looked puzzled. "That usually means more work for me." Ethan laughed. "In a way, yes. The city council wants to expand our training program. They want to partner with us to bring it to other factories, and they want you to lead the training." Luis blinked, surprised. "Me? But I'm no manager. I'm just—" "You're the best teacher we have," Ethan interrupted gently. "You've helped more people in the last 6 months than anyone else here. They trust you. You make them believe they can do this." Luis shook his head, almost embarrassed. "I never asked for any of this," Ethan smiled. "That's exactly why you deserve it." Luis didn't answer right away. He looked around the workshop, the people, the machines, the laughter. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "If it means helping more people get their chance, I'll do it." That moment marked the start of something even bigger.